It was one of those quiet mornings that made the small town feel like it was still half asleep. The streets were empty except for a few people walking their dogs or heading to work. Out past the last row of houses, where the road turned to gravel and the fields opened wide, there stood a small wooden house with a wide porch and a faded American flag fluttering gently in the wind. That house belonged to a man named Jack Mercer. Jack lived there alone with his German shepherd, Rex. To anyone who passed by, he looked like just another man who liked peace and privacy. His truck was old, his clothes were plain, and his days were simple. But there was something about him that made people lower their voices when they spoke about him. No one really knew his story, and Jack preferred it that way. Every morning, Jack woke before the sun rose. He'd step out onto his porch with a cup of coffee, sit on the same wooden chair and watch the light creep over the fields. Rex would lie at his feet, his head resting on Jack's boots, waiting patiently for their morning walk. It was their routine, quiet, steady, comforting. Jack didn't say much, but the dog understood everything that mattered. Rex wasn't just a pet. He was trained, alert, and deeply loyal. There were moments when his eyes seemed to read Jack's thoughts before Jack even spoke. Sometimes during thunderstorms, when the sky cracked open and the rain pounded the earth, Rex would sense Jack's unease and stay close, pressing his head gently against Jack's leg. Those nights, Jack would stare out the window and say nothing. He had seen storms far worse than rain. The people in town knew Jack only as the quiet man who kept to himself. He was polite when spoken to, but never talked much about his past. Some folks said he had been in the military. Others guessed he worked security somewhere. When kids lost a ball over his fence, he always gave it back with a smile. When his elderly neighbor's tractor broke down, he helped fix it without being asked. But once the work was done, he'd go right back home and close the gate behind him. For Jack, life had become about peace, something he hadn't known for a long time. He had spent years in places where peace didn't exist, where every sound meant danger and every shadow could hide a threat. Those years had changed him. They had taken something out of him, a part he wasn't sure he could ever get back. So when he left it all behind, he came to this quiet corner of North Carolina to live the kind of life that didn't require looking over his shoulder. He never talked about the medals tucked away in a drawer, or the scars that ran along his arm. He didn't tell anyone about the friends he had lost or the missions that still played in his mind when he closed his eyes. The uniform was gone, but the memories stayed, silent, heavy, and always near. Some nights he'd sit by the fire with Rex lying beside him, and he'd whisper, "We made it home, buddy." And Rex, as if he understood every word, would lift his head and rest it gently on Jack's knee. Those moments meant everything. The world had taken enough from him. He wasn't going to let it take peace, too. Jack didn't need much. His house was small but clean, with shelves of old books and photos from years ago. There was one picture on the mantel that meant more than the rest. It was him and his old team standing in front of a helicopter, dust and heat in the air. They were smiling, but their eyes were tired. Most of them were gone now. He sometimes caught himself staring at that photo, remembering the jokes they told, the long nights, the noise of the rotor blades, and the silence afterward. Every day followed a rhythm. Jack worked part-time fixing fences, mowing fields, and helping out a local mechanic. It wasn't about the money, it was about staying busy. Idleness made his thoughts too loud. Rex was always nearby, sitting in the truck, watching. When Jack finished work, he'd throw a stick for him, and the dog would sprint like a flash, bringing it back with a wagging tail. Those little moments, the sound of Rex's paws on the dirt, the warmth of the sun, were what kept Jack grounded. People liked him, even if they didn't know him well. The local diner waitress always had his coffee ready when he came in, and the sheriff once offered him a job in the department. Jack politely refused. He'd had enough of orders and uniforms to last a lifetime. He wasn't running from his past. He just didn't want it to define him anymore. Sometimes kids in town would ask about Rex because he was different. He obeyed every command, waited at doors, and never barked without reason. "He's well trained," Jack would say with a small grin. He didn't mention that Rex had been trained just like the dogs who worked alongside soldiers overseas, trained to protect, to detect danger, and to stay calm under pressure. Rex had saved Jack's life once, years ago. That bond couldn't be explained. It was just there. Despite the calm, there were still days when Jack's mind drifted back to things he wished he could forget. The sudden loud noises, The smell of fuel and dust, the weight of silence after chaos. It all came back sometimes without warning. But then Rex would nudge his hand or bring his favorite ball, as if to remind him that the war was over. Life was here now, and that was enough. Jack had learned to live with the quiet. He fixed his own meals, kept his yard neat, and spent evenings watching the sun dip below the trees. It was a simple life, but he cherished it. He didn't crave excitement or recognition. He just wanted peace. But the world doesn't always respect peace, not even when a man has earned it 100 times over. That morning started like any other. The air was cool, the sky pale blue. Jack was repairing a section of his fence that had been knocked loose by the wind the night before. Rex was a few feet away, sniffing around the tall grass. It was calm, so calm that Jack didn't notice the 2 police cars turning down the gravel road toward his property. They were responding to a call, a mistake, as it would later turn out. Someone from down the road had reported a man with a gun walking along the property line. But Jack hadn't been holding a gun. He had been holding a hammer and a few nails. The officers didn't know that. From a distance, Jack's dark jacket and the glint of metal in his hand looked different through the trees. They didn't announce themselves right away. They parked at the edge of the driveway, doors open, voices low, eyes scanning. Rex noticed them first. He lifted his head, ears sharp, tail stiff. Jack turned, following his gaze. He saw the cars, the uniforms, the hands hovering near holsters. He frowned, confused, and set the hammer down on the fence post. Before he could call out, Rex started to bark. Not aggressively, just alertly, the way dogs do when strangers approach. Jack whistled softly. Easy, boy, but Rex didn't calm down. He sensed something. Tension in the air, the tone of the voices, maybe even Jack's own unease. He trotted forward a few steps, barking louder now. Jack raised his hand to the officers. Hey, what's going on? They shouted something he couldn't fully hear. One of them pointed toward Rex. Jack could feel his pulse pick up. He's fine, he called out. He's not going to hurt anyone. But it all happened too fast. The officers saw a large German shepherd running toward them and reacted the way their training told them to. One shouted, another stepped back, and then a single gunshot cracked through the air. Jack froze. The world seemed to stop moving. The sound echoed through the field, sharp and final. Rex stumbled mid-run, fell, and lay still. For a second, Jack couldn't move. His mind refused to understand what had just happened. The hammer slipped from his hand. He ran forward, shouting Rex's name. The officers yelled for him to stop, but he didn't hear them. He fell to his knees beside the dog, his hands trembling as he touched Rex's fur, already growing still. It was like a piece of him had been torn away. The officers approached cautiously, realizing too late that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Jack didn't look at them. He just kept whispering Rex's name over and over, as if saying it enough times would bring him back. Rex had been his family, his protector, his reminder that there was still good left in the world. And now, in one senseless moment, that was gone. The silence after the shot felt heavier than any explosion Jack had ever heard overseas. He sat there for what felt like forever. The smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. The sound of the officers' radios crackling somewhere behind him. His heart was pounding, but his face was calm, too calm. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold and clear like steel. The officers started to speak, to explain, to apologize, to justify, but he didn't respond. He stood slowly, brushed the dirt off his hands, and said in a low, steady voice, "You didn't have to do that." Then he turned back toward his house. Behind him, the officers stood frozen, realizing they had just made a mistake they couldn't undo. But what they didn't yet know, what no one in that small town knew, was who Jack Mercer really was. They had just shot the dog of a man who had once been one of the most skilled and dangerous operators in Delta Force history, and a man trained to keep calm in chaos, to observe, to wait, and to strike only when it mattered. And though he didn't raise his voice or show anger, something inside him shifted that day. The peace he had worked so hard to protect was gone, and nothing, not even his silence, would ever be the same again. The sun was still climbing when Jack carried Rex's body into the yard. The air was heavy and quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. The officers stood by their cars, unsure of what to say or do. They had already called it in, an incident involving a dog. But to Jack, it wasn't an incident. It was a life. His best friend. He laid Rex down on the soft patch of grass near the porch, the same spot where the dog liked to nap in the sun. Jack's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the collar, brushing the dust from Rex's fur. His breathing was slow and even, but his eyes were distant, like he wasn't really there anymore. One of the officers took a few hesitant steps forward. "Sir," he said softly, "we're really sorry about—" Jack didn't respond. He didn't look up. He just kept his hand on Rex's neck, feeling the stillness that shouldn't have been there. The officer stopped mid-sentence and backed away. Something about Jack's quietness unsettled them more than anger ever could. They could feel it, the weight of what they'd done and the presence of a man who wasn't ordinary. When more police arrived, they tried to handle things by the book. They asked questions, took notes, walked around the property, and spoke in low voices near their patrol cars. But Jack didn't join their conversation. He simply stood by the porch, silent, his expression unreadable. After a while, the county sheriff showed up. He was an older man, familiar to most folks in town. He'd met Jack a few times at the diner and always thought of him as a quiet, decent man. When he saw the dog lying in the yard and the two younger officers standing awkwardly nearby, he immediately understood that something had gone wrong. "Jack," the sheriff said gently, stepping closer. "Let me talk to you for a minute." Jack nodded once but said nothing. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry, son. Looks like there was some confusion. The call we got? It wasn't clear. The officers they thought wrong," Jack said, finally breaking his silence. His voice was calm, steady, and quiet. Too quiet. "They didn't ask. They didn't wait. They just shot." The sheriff lowered his eyes. "You're right. They should have handled it better." Jack looked down at Rex again. "He never hurt anyone. Not once." "I know," the sheriff said softly. "I'll make sure this gets looked into. I promise you that." Jack nodded, though his expression didn't change. The sheriff knew that kind of look. He had seen it in veterans before. It was the look of someone who had seen too much to be easily comforted. When everyone finally left, the yard was still again. Jack sat beside Rex for a long time, staring out toward the horizon. The quiet around him felt different now, hollow, almost cruel. The dog's bowl was still by the porch steps. The leash hung by the door. Every small detail reminded him of a friendship that was suddenly gone. That night he couldn't sleep. He tried to read, to distract himself, but the words on the page blurred together. Memories came back. The first day he met Rex, the way the pup had clumsily tripped over his own paws, the training sessions, the long walks. He remembered how Rex used to sit beside him when nightmares woke him up in the middle of the night. That dog had been there for him when nothing else was. Jack wasn't an emotional man, but that night he cried quietly, his face buried in his hands. It wasn't just grief. It was the feeling of losing the last piece of peace he had found. By morning, he decided to bury Rex under the old oak tree behind the house. It was a spot filled with sunlight and shade, a place where birds often gathered. He dug the ground carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. When it was done, he wrapped Rex in a blanket and lowered him gently into the earth. As he covered the grave, he whispered, "Thank you, buddy, for everything." After that, Jack didn't talk to anyone for a few days. He kept to himself, fixing small things around the house, cleaning tools that didn't need cleaning, trying to stay busy. But people noticed his absence. At the diner, the waitress asked if anyone had seen him. The mechanic he worked with stopped by his place but found the gate locked. Word spread quickly about what had happened. In small towns, news travels faster than cars. Everyone had their own version of the story. Some said the police had overreacted, others said it was an accident. But everyone agreed on one thing: it shouldn't have happened. The sheriff came by again a few days later. He found Jack sitting on the porch staring at the field. "I just wanted to give you an update," the sheriff said. "The department's reviewing everything. There'll be an internal report. The officer who fired the shot's been put on leave while we figure this out." Jack nodded slowly. "Will it change anything?" The sheriff hesitated. "I don't know, but it's a start." Jack looked at him for a long moment, then said, "He didn't mean to do it, I get that. But there has to be a lesson in this. For them. For all of you." The sheriff nodded. "You're right." After he left, Jack sat in silence again. He wasn't thinking about revenge. That wasn't who he was, but he also couldn't just let it pass. Too many people in uniform acted without thinking, without understanding the weight of their actions. And he knew better than most what that weight felt like. He decided to start documenting everything: the call, the reports, the statements. He wanted the truth to be clear, not twisted or forgotten. He wrote down every detail of that morning, from the sound of the tires on the gravel to the echo of the gunshot. He took photos of the yard, the porch, even Rex's collar. It wasn't about anger. It was about respect, for a life that deserved to mean something. Days turned into weeks. The investigation dragged on. Jack tried to stay patient, but the silence from the police department started to feel like avoidance. No one called him with updates anymore. When he asked, they told him it was being handled. Meanwhile, people in town started taking sides. Some defended the officers, saying they had followed protocol. Others stood by Jack, saying it was wrong no matter how you looked at it. For the first time, the little town began to feel divided. Jack didn't argue with anyone. He stayed polite but distant. The truth didn't need defending. It just needed to be seen. One afternoon, a young local reporter showed up at his gate. She had heard about what happened and wanted to tell his side of the story. Jack almost said no, he didn't like cameras or attention. But something inside him told him it was time to speak. They sat on the porch and she asked questions gently, respectfully. Jack told her about Rex, how he was trained, how loyal he was, and how he had never harmed anyone. He explained what happened that morning, every detail. He didn't raise his voice or dramatize anything. He just told the truth. When the article came out, it spread quickly online. People across the state began sharing it. Comments poured in from strangers offering support, some even sharing their own stories of loss and misunderstanding. Jack didn't read most of them, but he appreciated the kindness. It reminded him that even though the world could be careless, it could also be compassionate. The pressure on the local police department grew. News outlets began asking questions, and the sheriff's office was forced to release more information. The truth came out. The officers had acted on a mistaken report without proper confirmation. They had broken several standard procedures. When the sheriff came to tell Jack, his face looked tired. "They're facing disciplinary action," he said. "One of them might be dismissed." Jack nodded, taking it in. "That won't bring him back." "No," the sheriff agreed quietly. "But it's something." Jack didn't smile. He just looked out across the field, where the wind moved gently through the tall grass. After that, people started coming by the house, neighbors, friends, even strangers, to check on him. They brought food, flowers, and notes of sympathy. He thanked them all but didn't let anyone stay long. Grief for him was a private thing, but the support meant more than he admitted. It showed him that people cared, that justice still mattered even in small corners of the world. As weeks passed, Jack began to heal, slowly. He started walking along the same paths he used to take with Rex. The first few times were the hardest. Every step felt like a reminder, but over time it became a way of remembering rather than mourning. He'd stop by the oak tree sometimes and talk quietly, as if Rex could still hear him. "I'm trying, buddy," he'd say. "I'm doing my best." And in a strange way, those walks gave him strength again. Jack didn't plan on becoming a voice for anyone. But people began reaching out to him. Veterans, dog owners, families who had lost pets in similar ways. They thanked him for speaking up, for staying calm, for showing dignity instead of rage. He realized something then. Maybe this wasn't just his story. Maybe it was a chance to change something bigger. He started meeting with a few local groups that trained police on handling animals and understanding veterans. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he knew what could happen when fear replaced judgment. The man who once wanted nothing more than peace found himself standing quietly in front of small gatherings, talking about patience, respect, and restraint. He spoke softly but carried the weight of experience in every word. Peace, he'd say, isn't just about silence. It's about understanding. It's about learning before you act. And people listened. Back home, the house still felt a little too quiet. But it was a peaceful kind of quiet again, the kind he could live with. The world had taken something from him, yes, but it had also given him a purpose he hadn't expected. Jack would never forget that morning, and he'd never stop missing Rex. But he had turned pain into something that mattered. He had found a new kind of strength, the kind that doesn't come from battle or revenge, but from grace. And though he would never say it out loud, deep down he knew that Rex would have been proud. The weeks that followed were strange for Jack. He had spent years avoiding attention, but now people in town whispered his name whenever he walked by. Some would stop him at the store or outside the diner just to say how sorry they were about what happened. Others offered their support in quieter ways, by leaving a note in his mailbox or a meal on his porch. At first, Jack didn't know how to react. He wasn't used to people knowing his business. He had always kept his life small and private, but now it felt like the whole town was watching him. He appreciated their kindness, but he also felt uneasy. He hadn't asked for sympathy. All he wanted was the truth, and for something like that never to happen again. Still, he couldn't ignore that people cared. That mattered. A few days after the newspaper story went online, Jack received a letter in the mail. It was from a man he had served with many years ago, a quiet reminder of a life he'd buried deep. The letter was short, written in simple words. Saw the story. I'm proud of how you handled it. You always were calm under pressure. Don't let them silence you. Jack read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his pocket. That night, he sat by the fireplace and thought about the men he used to serve with. Many of them were gone now, but their lessons still stayed with him. He remembered the discipline, the focus, the way they handled chaos. It wasn't about pride, it was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. He hadn't realized how much of that old self still lived inside him until now. The sheriff's department called again a week later. They told him the internal review had been completed, and they were holding a community meeting to discuss the outcome. Jack hesitated for a moment before agreeing to attend. He didn't like meetings or crowds, but this wasn't just about him anymore. When the day came, the town hall was full. Every seat was taken and people stood along the walls. Jack arrived quietly, wearing a simple shirt and jeans, his expression calm. He didn't sit near the front. He stayed in the back corner listening. The sheriff spoke first. He explained the investigation findings. The officers had acted without clear communication, violating safety procedures. One of them was suspended, the other reassigned to desk duty. He promised better training and more community involvement moving forward. Some people clapped, others muttered. It wasn't enough for many of them. Then someone from the audience stood up and said, "What about the man who lost his dog? Doesn't he deserve to speak?" The room turned quiet and all eyes went to Jack. He hadn't planned to say anything. He didn't want to make a speech or point fingers. But something inside him told him this was his moment to turn pain into purpose. He stood slowly, walked to the front, and took a deep breath. "I'm not here to argue," he said softly, "and I'm not here to blame. What happened was a mistake, but a mistake with a cost. My dog wasn't just an animal. He was family. He was trained, calm, and loyal. He didn't deserve what happened. But this isn't about punishment. It's about learning." People listened in silence. Jack continued, "I've seen what happens when fear takes control. It makes people act before thinking. I spent years serving this country in places where every decision mattered. The hardest lesson I ever learned was restraint. The ability to hold your fire when your heart is racing and your instincts tell you otherwise. That's what real training should teach. That's what saves lives." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm asking for change," he said. "Not just for me, not just for Rex, but for every family, every officer, and every animal that might face the same mistake. Train better, communicate better, think before you act." When he finished, the room stayed silent for a few seconds. Then slowly, people began to clap. It wasn't the loud kind of applause that comes from excitement. It was soft and steady, full of respect. Even the sheriff nodded with a faint smile. Jack sat back down quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He hadn't wanted praise, but he could feel something shift in the room. The conversation was no longer about blame, it was about progress. After the meeting, several people came up to shake his hand. One woman said, "You've got a gift, you know that. You made people listen without shouting." Jack smiled politely and said, "I just said what I believe." But deep down, something inside him had awakened, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. In the days that followed, he began receiving invitations to speak at small community gatherings. Animal shelters, veteran groups, and police training centers all wanted to hear from him. He never saw himself as a speaker, but he went anyway. He spoke from the heart, never reading from notes, just telling the truth about patience, understanding, and the cost of rash decisions. His voice was calm but firm. It carried the weight of experience, real experience. One evening after a talk, a young police recruit approached him. "Sir," the recruit said nervously, "I read about you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. And I promise I'll remember what you said. I'll take that lesson with me." Jack placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. "That's all I could ask for," he said. Moments like that gave him quiet satisfaction. He wasn't out to make headlines. He just wanted to plant seeds that might grow into change, but not everyone was happy about his growing influence. Some people in the police department felt defensive, as if his story made them look bad. Rumors started to spread that Jack was exaggerating his background, that maybe he wasn't who people thought he was. At first, Jack ignored it. He had no need to prove himself. But then one of the local TV stations picked up the story and started asking questions. They requested his service records to confirm his military history. When they found out who he truly was, the tone of everything changed. The report aired one evening. Local man who lost dog in police incident turns out to be decorated Delta Force veteran. The anchor's voice carried both surprise and admiration. They showed old photos, blurred faces, desert landscapes, medals that most people didn't recognize. The story spread fast. By morning, it was on national news outlets. Jack's quiet life was gone overnight. People called him a hero, though he didn't like that word. He never saw himself that way. He had done his duty, nothing more. But now the world knew his past, and that brought new challenges. Reporters began showing up at his gate, cameras flashing. They wanted interviews, quotes, reactions. Jack turned them all away. He wasn't interested in fame. He just wanted respect for what had been lost and understanding for what needed to change. Still, the story had taken on a life of its own. Veterans from across the country reached out offering support. Some shared their own stories of losing service animals or facing misunderstandings after coming home. Jack read every letter and replied to as many as he could. He found comfort in knowing he wasn't alone, but he also knew the attention wouldn't last forever. News always moved on. What mattered was what people did after the cameras left. So Jack began working quietly behind the scenes. He helped a local organization design a training program for police officers about dealing with service animals and veterans. He spent hours reviewing materials, giving feedback and sharing insights from his own experiences. He didn't get paid for it, and he didn't want to. It was his way of honoring Rex's memory. At night, when the world was quiet again, he would sit by the oak tree where Rex was buried. Sometimes he'd talk softly, almost as if the dog could still hear him. "You're still doing good things, buddy," he'd say. "You didn't deserve what happened, but you're still helping people." The wind would move through the branches, and for a moment, he'd feel peace. Still, there were hard days. There were mornings when he woke up expecting to hear Rex's paws on the floor, and the silence felt too sharp. There were moments when guilt crept in. What if he had called the dog back faster? What if he'd done something different? But he pushed those thoughts away. Some things weren't meant to be carried forever. Instead, he focused on what he could control: the message. Months passed, and the training program he'd helped create was officially adopted by several nearby departments. Officers began learning how to read animal behavior, how to de-escalate situations, and how to handle calls involving veterans with sensitivity and care. It wasn't a huge change, but it was something. A start. People began calling it Rex's Rule, the idea that every officer should think before they act. Jack never asked for that name, but it touched him deeply. He didn't say much about it, but those who knew him could see the pride in his eyes when the program was mentioned. One evening, the sheriff came by his house again. "You know," he said, leaning on the porch rail, "you've done more for this community in a few months than most folks do in a lifetime." Jack smiled faintly. "I just wanted to make sure it didn't happen again." The sheriff nodded. "Well, you've done that. And more." After he left, Jack watched the sunset from his porch. The light painted the sky in soft orange and gold, and for the first time in a long while he felt at peace again. The pain would never fully leave, but it no longer controlled him. He had turned loss into something that mattered. He still missed Rex every day, but now when he thought of him, he didn't see the moment he was lost. He saw the years of loyalty, the companionship, and the lessons they had shared. He saw a story that had grown beyond both of them, one that might save lives and hearts in ways he'd never expected. As the wind rustled through the trees, Jack whispered, "You did good, boy. You did real good." And for a man who had once lived by silence, that simple truth was enough. Jack's life had changed in ways he never asked for. The quiet days he once cherished were now mixed with letters, calls, and the occasional reporter still trying to reach him. Though months had passed since the shooting, people still remembered his story. They called him a hero, a symbol of calm strength, a man who turned tragedy into change. But Jack didn't feel like any of those things. He still woke up before sunrise, still made his morning coffee, still looked out across the same fields. The difference was that now, when he sat on the porch, there was an empty space where Rex used to rest. The silence hadn't grown easier. It had just become part of him, like a scar you learn to live with. He tried to move forward in small ways. He volunteered at a local training center for veterans returning home, teaching them how to readjust to civilian life. He didn't lecture. He just listened, shared a few words, and offered the quiet kind of wisdom that only experience can give. Many of them had dogs too, service animals trained for support, comfort, or protection. Jack found himself drawn to them. He could see the same kind of connection he once had with Rex. Sometimes the dogs would walk up to him as if they sensed something familiar in him, and he'd smile softly, scratching behind their ears. One afternoon, after a long session at the center, the director approached him. "You ever think about getting another dog?" she asked. Jack hesitated. "I've thought about it," he said. "But it doesn't feel right yet." She nodded with understanding. "When the time's right, you'll know." He hoped she was right, but deep down he wasn't sure. Rex wasn't just a dog. He had been part of his life in a way that couldn't be replaced. The idea of bringing another into his world felt like trying to fill a space that wasn't meant to be filled. Still, time has a way of softening even the hardest memories. As the seasons changed, Jack noticed the world beginning to move on. The news stopped calling. The letters slowed down. Life in town returned to normal. But one thing didn't fade: the small ripple of change that he had helped start police departments in nearby counties, had begun adopting new training programs modeled after Rex's rule. Jack was invited to sit in on one of the first sessions. He wasn't sure if he wanted to, but curiosity got the better of him. When he arrived at the academy, a group of young officers stood in a circle as their instructor spoke. They were learning how to read animal behavior, the body language, the signals, the difference between threat and fear. Jack watched quietly from the back as one of them raised a question. "What if it's a high-pressure situation?" the recruit asked. "What if there's no time to think?" The instructor paused and looked at Jack. "You want to answer that one?" Jack stepped forward slowly. "There's always time to think," he said calmly. "Even half a second can change what happens next. That's what training is for, and not to act fast, but to act right." The room was silent. The recruits listened closely. He could see in their faces the same eagerness and uncertainty he once had when he was young. He spoke for a few more minutes, sharing short, simple truths from experience and the kind that stick longer than lectures. Afterward, one of the recruits walked up to him and said, "I didn't know you were the man from the news. I just thought you were another instructor. I guess we could learn a lot from you." Jack smiled faintly. "I'm still learning myself," he said. That night, as he drove home, he felt something new, a quiet pride that had nothing to do with fame. It wasn't about what people called him. It was about knowing that maybe, just maybe, fewer mistakes would be made because of what he had done. That was enough, but life had another turn waiting for him. One morning, Jack received a call from an old contact in the military, someone he hadn't heard from in years. The voice on the other end was warm but carried a hint of formality. "Jack, it's been a long time," the man said. "We've been following what you've been doing. Impressive work, my friend. You've managed to teach lessons that even we could learn from." Jack chuckled softly. "Didn't expect to hear that." "Well," the man continued, "there's a leadership program for veterans we're putting together, one that helps bridge the gap between military discipline and community service. We'd like you to come speak." Jack leaned back in his chair. "You sure about that?" "I'm not exactly a public speaker." "You don't have to be," the man replied. "You just have to be honest. That's what people listen to." After some thought, Jack agreed. The event was held a few weeks later in a modest hall filled with veterans, police officers, and community leaders. Jack stood at the podium, his posture relaxed but strong. He didn't use notes, and he never did. I used to think peace was something you could earn, he began, like a medal or a rank. But peace isn't something you fight for. It's something you learn to live with, even when the world doesn't make it easy. He spoke about fear, control, and the importance of understanding before reacting. He told them about Rex not as a symbol but as a friend, the one who had taught him patience in ways no training ever could. He didn't dramatize the story or make it sound larger than life. He just told it straight from the heart. When he finished, the room stood in quiet applause. It wasn't loud or showy, it was sincere. People didn't just respect his words, they believed them. After the event, several attendees approached him to thank him. One of them, a senior police captain, said, "You know, your story changed the way I lead my team. We talk more, we listen more. We think before we act." Jack nodded, grateful. That's all I ever wanted. He drove home that night under a wide sky full of stars. It reminded him of the nights he used to spend overseas. The same sky, different world. He realized that for the first time in years he wasn't running from his past. He was learning to live with it. But even as things seemed to be falling into place, Jack knew healing wasn't a straight line. There were still nights when memories came back, flashes of old missions, the echo of loss, and sometimes that single gunshot that changed everything. He didn't fight those thoughts anymore. He just let them come and go like passing storms. One evening, while visiting the Veterans Center, he noticed a small puppy wandering near the parking lot. It was thin, dirty, and shivering. Jack crouched down, speaking softly. The pup wagged its tail nervously and took a few hesitant steps toward him. "Hey there, little one," Jack said gently. "Where'd you come from?" He looked around, no collar, no owner in sight. After a moment of thought, he wrapped the pup in his jacket and took it home. That night, the small dog slept by the fireplace, curled up in a ball. Jack watched him for a long time, unsure what to feel. Part of him was afraid to open his heart again, but another part, the quiet, hopeful part, told him this was meant to be. He didn't name the dog right away. It took weeks before he finally did. One morning, as he poured his coffee, the pup came running, tail wagging wildly, bumping into everything along the way. Jack laughed, a real, genuine laugh one he hadn't felt in a long time. "All right," he said, smiling. "You're staying. Let's call you Scout." Scout wasn't like Rex. He was clumsy, energetic, and easily distracted. But Jack didn't mind. He trained him gently, not for work or commands, but for companionship. The house felt alive again. With Scout around, Jack began to rebuild his old routines. Morning walks, evenings on the porch, quiet talks beneath the stars. Life felt lighter again. One day, as they walked near town, a young boy ran up, pointing at the dog. "Is that Rex's rule guy?" his mother whispered, recognizing Jack. Jack smiled kindly. "Not Rex," he said softly. "This one's Scout," the woman smiled back. "Your story helped me teach my kids about kindness," she said. "Thank you." Jack nodded, touched by her words. It reminded him that even small stories can reach far places. Months turned into a year. The programs continued to grow, and Jack became a quiet mentor for many, not just in the military but in the community. He never sought attention or recognition. He just wanted to live with purpose. Every so often, people would ask him if he missed his old life, the missions, the adrenaline, the danger. He always gave the same answer: "I've had enough of war. Now I'm fighting for peace." It wasn't about being famous or being remembered. It was about leaving the world a little better than he found it. Sometimes at sunset, he would sit by the oak tree with Scout lying beside him. The light would pour through the branches, golden and warm. He'd look at Rex's resting place and whisper, "We're doing all right, buddy. You'd like this one." And as the wind rustled softly through the leaves, it felt like an answer. Jack had come full circle, from soldier to survivor, from loss to legacy. And though life had tested him in ways few could understand, he had found his way back to peace not by forgetting the past, but by building something meaningful from it. He no longer needed to hide from the world or from who he was. He had learned the hardest truth of all, that real strength isn't in fighting battles but in knowing when to forgive, when to teach, and when to simply live. As the last light faded and the stars began to appear, Scout lifted his head, ears twitching at the night sounds. Jack reached down, patting him gently. "Let's head in, boy," he said. "Tomorrow's another day." And for the first time in a long time, tomorrow didn't feel heavy. It felt like hope. Time has a way of softening even the hardest parts of memory. For Jack, the quiet mornings had become his favorite part of each day. The sun would rise slowly over the horizon, spilling a soft gold light across the fields. The sound of birds and the gentle rustle of the trees reminded him that life kept moving, even when you weren't ready for it. Scout had grown into a loyal companion, full of energy and personality. He was still clumsy, but he had a big heart, and that was all that mattered to Jack. Wherever Jack went, Scout followed, to the store, to the Veterans Center, even to the local coffee shop where people had gotten used to seeing them together. In the town, Jack had become a familiar face. Not the kind of local celebrity people took pictures with, but the kind everyone respected quietly. When someone had trouble, they'd often ask for his advice. When the Veterans Center needed volunteers, he was always the first to show up. He didn't talk much about his past anymore. Most people already knew parts of it, and the ones who didn't need to. Jack preferred to talk about what came next, about rebuilding trust, learning from mistakes, and giving people a second chance. One evening, while he was walking Scout near the river, a young police officer stopped his patrol car and waved. "Evening, sir," he said kindly. "That your dog?" Jack smiled. "Yeah, his name's Scout." The officer knelt down and let Scout sniff his hand. "Good-looking dog. Heard you helped write that new training program. We use it now at the academy." Jack nodded. "Glad to hear it's working." "It is," the officer said. "We've learned a lot about patience and about taking that extra second before acting. It's made a big difference." Jack looked out toward the river. "That's good," he said quietly. "That's all I ever wanted." The officer stood and gave a small nod before heading back to his car. As he drove away, Jack watched him go with a faint, peaceful smile. Moments like that reminded him that change didn't need to be loud. Sometimes it just needed to be real. Later that week, the town invited Jack to a small ceremony. They were dedicating a section of the local park to service dogs and their handlers. It wasn't a grand event, just a simple gathering of people, some with dogs at their sides, all sharing the same respect for loyalty and courage. Jack didn't plan to speak. He preferred to stay in the background. But as the mayor finished his short speech, someone called out, "Let's hear from Jack." The crowd clapped softly, encouraging him. Jack hesitated for a moment, then walked up to the small stage. Scout followed, wagging his tail. Jack took a slow breath. "I never planned to be standing here," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Life has a strange way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. What happened a few years ago was hard, harder than I can explain. But out of that loss came something I never saw coming. Change, understanding, and the chance to make things better." He looked out at the crowd. Veterans, families, police officers, and neighbors. "This park isn't about one story," he continued. "It's about every bond between a person and their dog, every act of service that goes unseen, and every choice to do better the next time. If we remember that, then none of it was for nothing." The audience stood in quiet respect. No one cheered or shouted. They just listened, and that was enough. After the ceremony, people came up to shake his hand or thank him. One woman with tears in her eyes said softly, "My son's a police officer now. He told me your story helped him understand how to stay calm even in tense moments. You changed more lives than you'll ever know." Jack smiled gently. "That means more than you think," he said. That night, as he walked home with Scout trotting beside him, the air felt lighter. The town was quiet, the streets softly lit by the orange glow of the lamps. He could hear the crickets in the distance and the steady rhythm of Scout's paws against the dirt road. When they reached home, Jack stopped by the old oak tree. It stood tall and strong, the same place where Rex had been laid to rest. Jack knelt beside it, brushing a hand over the grass. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. "We did good." Scout sat beside him, tilting his head curiously as if he could feel the weight of the moment. Jack smiled and gave him a gentle pat. Life had a different rhythm now. It wasn't about missions or medals or even justice. It was about peace, the kind that comes from acceptance. Jack had seen what happens when people act out of fear, and he had learned what happens when they act out of understanding. He hoped that the world would keep choosing the latter. Over the next year, Jack continued working quietly with local departments and veterans programs. He became known as the person who could bridge two worlds, the disciplined, structured life of service and the unpredictable reality of civilian life. He taught officers how to stay calm under pressure, how to listen before they acted, and how to see the human side of every situation. But what people loved most was his humility. He never told anyone what to do. He simply told stories, short ones, honest ones, that made people think. One afternoon, during a training session, a young recruit asked, "Sir, how do you keep calm when everything feels like it's going wrong?" Jack thought for a moment before answering. "You focus on what you can control," he said. "You can't always control what happens around you, but you can control what you do next. That choice at that single moment is where your strength really lives." The recruit nodded, writing it down in his notebook as if it were gold. Jack smiled faintly. He didn't think of his words as wisdom, just truth learned the hard way. As time went on, Jack's story reached farther than he ever expected. A documentary was made about his life, not the kind filled with drama or action scenes, but a quiet one, showing how one man's calm strength changed an entire community. He agreed to it only because he hoped it might help others. When the film premiered at a small local theater, Jack sat in the back row, wearing his old worn jacket and holding a cup of coffee. People filled the seats, and when the lights dimmed, his face appeared on the screen, talking about the meaning of restraint, compassion, and the lessons Rex had left behind. He wasn't used to seeing himself like that. But as the story unfolded, he realized it wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever faced loss and chosen to build something good from it. When the lights came back on, the audience stood and applauded softly. Some people wiped away tears. Jack simply nodded, grateful but quiet as always. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a police chief in another state. The letter said, "Because of your story, we started a new unit focused on compassion training. We call it Project Rex. It's already saved lives." Jack read the letter twice before setting it down. He looked at Scout, who was lying at his feet. "You hear that, buddy?" he said with a smile. "Your predecessor's still making a difference." Scout thumped his tail happily against the floor, and Jack chuckled softly. The years rolled on quietly after that. Jack grew older, but his spirit stayed steady. The house remained simple. No trophies, no framed medals, just a few photos and the warmth of memories. The oak tree out back grew stronger each year, and Scout never left his side. People still came to visit from time to time, younger veterans, new officers, or students who wanted to hear his story firsthand. He always welcomed them with coffee and a calm voice. He told them what he had learned over the years, that strength isn't loud, courage isn't about anger, and healing isn't about forgetting. It's about finding peace where you once found pain. Sometimes, when the evening light stretched across the yard, Jack would sit on the porch with Scout's head resting on his knee. He'd close his eyes and just listen to the wind, the birds, the soft hum of the world around him. In those moments, he felt the kind of peace that all his years of service had never given him. It wasn't the silence of battle or the calm before a storm. It was the peace that comes when you finally forgive the world for being imperfect, and yourself for expecting it not to be. And as the sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Jack would whisper softly, almost to himself, "We did all right." The world didn't know the full weight of that statement, but he did. It meant that through loss and patience, through lessons and forgiveness, he had finally found the thing he had been chasing all along, peace that lasts. And in that quiet corner of town, under the same sky that had watched over him through every chapter of his life, Jack finally felt at home.